You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health Podcast. I'm speaking to David Edelman. He's a visiting scholar at the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, Dartmouth College. He's a former lecturer at the Department of Psychology, University of California, San Diego. So, David, thank you for coming. How are you doing?
Good. How are you? Great to be here.
All right. Yeah. So, what are you studying? It looks like consciousness and non-human animals. Is that the focus?
Yeah, that's generally the idea. Started off as a sort of a theoretical interest. Some years ago, I co-authored some papers with my friend and colleague NonSelf, who's now at University of Sussex, and Bernie Bars, who got fairly well known for the global workspace theory of consciousness. And so that sort of transformed over the years into something that was not just theoretical, but perhaps, was getting some traction experimentally. And so one of my main sort of interest at this point is visual perception in the octopus, actually cognition generally in the octopus. And that's sort of my model organism at the moment. I think it's a profoundly wonderful model organism for a variety of reasons, which we can get into.
Yeah, how come not dogs? They seem to be pretty conscious and pretty cool to work with.
Yeah, dogs are really cool. I love my dogs, and I think I think my dogs are entirely conscious, of course. But the main reason that I settled on octopus is, in my meanderings to kind of come up with the research for these papers some years ago, I happened on all of the studies of behavior in octopus, which pointed to an animal that had a pretty sophisticated suite of behavioral adaptations. And while their brain isn't exactly a black box to us, we have some information to go on. Most of the work that's been done that sort of points to some sort of intelligence, albeit an alien intelligence, is behavioral. So they represent a perfect sort of evolutionary experiment in the sense that the last common ancestor we shared, or that vertebrates generally shared with cephalopods, including the octopus, was 500 million years ago, which means that our common ancestor was an animal that didn't have much of a nervous system and had absolutely no eyes, something worm-like, which is pretty extraordinary and points to the idea that whatever intelligence that cephalopods developed and putative conscious processing happened in parallel with the vertebrate line. It wasn't as a result of evolving from some common ancestor that itself was intelligent and or aware. So that's pretty extraordinary. That indicates that this is a totally independent evolutionary experiment.
To trace when consciousness first began, does anyone have an idea of when that all of a sudden happened? Or do people think that all life has consciousness?
Well, there are quite a few people who believe that all life in some form or other has some sense of awareness, down to the single cell. I'm afraid I'm not one of those people. I think that awareness takes a complex nervous system, but not just a complex nervous system, a nervous system that allows for the integration, fast integration of a lot of sensory information into sort of bound percepts that organism can remember and recall. And so, yeah, I'm very interested in the origins of consciousness. I think it goes back very, very early, but I don't think it goes back to single-cell animals. I think it goes back to sometime deep in the Cambrian. And I think one of the innovations that probably paved the way or appeared in lockstep, perhaps, with awareness was the emergence of eyes that could focus on objects that were both near and far. In other words, eyes that were capable of accommodation, eyes that had the capacity for distance vision. And, well, why do I think that that's important? I think that's important because if you can see something from afar before that something has seen you, whether it's predator or prey, all of a sudden time is on your side. If you don't move, if you stay still and you watch or you monitor that something in the distance, you can potentially plan for your next move. So distance vision is sort of important in that sense. So you don't have to react instantly. You don't have to escape instantly as long as the predator or the prey species hasn't seen you. And you have a tremendous advantage once you're capable of monitoring a scene from afar. So I think distance vision is very important. And the very first evidence I think that we have that, distance vision, is apparent is deep in the Cambrian. So sometime between 540 and say 520 million years. And that's the very period in which basically every form of eye that's ever existed and that exists today appears in a very short period of time. In rapid order, you have all kinds of eyes, but this is a particular kind of an eye. It's a single compartment. It's not like an insect eye with multiple, what we call ommatidia, so multiple facets. It's a single eye, liquid filled. It has a focusing lens, and that focusing lens allows you, of course, to accommodate and to see objects that are close by and objects that are far away. So I think that's a pretty important innovation and a clue as to when awareness came on the scene.
Well, what about the immune system, for instance, in people? I mean, in order for there to be an immune system, there has to be what's called self and non-self. So wouldn't that be a form of consciousness?
Well, I don't know whether I'd go so far as to say it's consciousness, but it's a very interesting thing that you bring up because it is an important. I would say it's an important contingency. I mean, it's an important aspect to define self versus non-self. And for future reference through the duration of the podcast, I should clarify that I make a distinction between awareness of sort of a primary or sensory variety and self-awareness. I think there's a distinction. I think you can be aware of a scene, but there doesn't necessarily have to be an agent within that scene. You don't necessarily have to be aware of yourself within that scene. Now, that's a little bit different than talking about recognizing the immune response, recognizing self versus foreign invader. And it's interesting you bring that up because my dad, Gerald Edelman, kind of had a pivotal role in the formulation of modern immunology. He was the guy who cracked the structure of gamma globulin, the human antibody, in the 60s. And he had some very early ideas about this as well. And it's interesting that you bring it up, too, for the fact that this is what guided him on his path as he transitioned from immunology into developmental biology and finally into neurobiology. And he, in his time, was sort of a consciousness theoretician. He had an idea about what consciousness was. So I think that what T cells do, what the immune system does, is definitely distinguishing between self and non-self. But do I believe that it is of the same variety as what you would see in an animal, that is aware of itself moving through a world? I don't think I would accept that. Although I do believe that kind of a system or that kind of a process is very elemental in the origins of intelligence and the origins of awareness. Only, of course, instantiated in nervous systems, in brains, and not in the lymphatic system or the immune response.
Well, what about in the squid? Do you believe the squid is the type of squid that you study? Do you believe it's conscious or something at some lower level?
Right. Actually, I study solely octopuses. So octopuses and squid they're very closely related. The three living coleoid or soft-bodied cephalopods are squid, octopus, and cuttlefish. Now, if you look at an octopus, what's interesting about an octopus is we think of them as having arms. We actually define their appendages as arms because they have sort of multiple degrees of freedom. They can do all kinds of things with those arms. They can even form artificial elbows, as Benjamin Hochner in Israel elegantly showed, and reproduce those elbows and picking up objects. They don't have a hard skeleton, right? So it's not like a set of lever arms. It's not hard bones to which muscles are attached. It's a hydrostatic. So they're all soft-bodied. So effectively, when they make an elbow, they're essentially limiting the movement in a particular aspect of their arm in a particular way, and it's more or less the same area every time, or close to the same area every time. And they pick up objects as we would sort of pick up objects. Now, squid don't really do that. They actually have tentacles. We think of octopuses as having arms. We think of squid as having tentacles. And what does that mean? Well, that means that squid can hunt. They're very capable hunters like octopuses. But when they use their appendages, when they use their tentacles, they're essentially just grabbing objects. They can do some interesting things. They can pull the masks off of scuba divers they want to get rid of off the coast of Mexico, and we've seen that happen a number of times. It's a pretty interesting behavior.
Wow.
They understand that as soon as they remove the mask and the respirator, this troublesome little thing that's bugging them will instantly rise to the surface and get out of their way. So that's pretty cool.
Cool.
But they don't really use their appendages the same way. They're more limited in the use of their appendages. Same thing with cuttlefish. Cuttlefish also have tentacles, and when you watch them hunting, they can lie in wait for, the prey to come by. And they use two specialized tentacles. Actually, they have 10, not just 8. They use these two special sort of spear-like tentacles to grab whatever is swimming by if they want to eat it. But that's kind of the limits. Those are the limits of their sort of dexterity, if you like. Whereas octopus do some really, really extraordinary things with their arms. And that actually also speaks to, some degree of complexity in their nervous system, but also in their behavior, obviously, that is perhaps ranks them as somewhat above cuttlefish and squid, who are no slouches, but nevertheless, there's a difference.
So what are you, what is it that you're studying? I mean, what I wanted to say to you is, like for myself, I would think that most people feel like they are in a tennis ball sized area right behind their eyes, or like behind and above their eyes. Like when I think about myself, where am I? I am in this spot. I don't feel like I am in my finger or I'm in my leg. It's weird. I'm composed of all these individual cells, and where is my consciousness? Why do the brain cells, in particular, make this thing called consciousness? Why does it feel like to me that that's where it is in my body and not other places?
Right.
Are you able to elucidate any of this?
It's it's kind of hard, but one thing I would say is that there was a sort of a trend early on in the development of nervous systems, which is a trend toward centralization, right? So, or what is also referred to as cephalization, the idea that you had a central sort of neural core that would act as sort of the central processor for all of these sort of peripheral elements, for your limbs, for your viscera, your stomach, your gut, et cetera, et cetera. And as to, why we have this sense that, it's this space behind my eyes, right, that is doing all the heavy lifting in terms of awareness, and it's not somewhere else. It's a really good question, but it maybe stands to reason that that's the case because that central core is pulling together all this vital information on which any one of your conscious percepts is based. Now, conscious percepts can be pretty complicated. They can be pretty simple or relatively simple, but they can be pretty complicated. They can involve internal or intrinsic sorts of signals, interoceptive signals, right? Signals from your gut, signals from, other aspects of your core. they can involve peripheral signals. They can involve signals from your fingers, signals, or translation, I should say, of information coming from the outside world as it interacts with sensors within your skin, or pressure sensors, temperature sensors, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we have this sense that it's this sort of space between our eyes, this thing inside our skulls, because essentially that's where everything comes together. That being said, I have to be very careful, because I don't want to sort of say the brain is sort of separate and apart in terms of sort of awareness, separate and apart from the rest of the body. I would say your brain is your body is your brain. But that being said, maybe it's a convenient, I wouldn't say illusion, but maybe it's a convenient notion that everything sort of resides, behind your eyes, effectively, or between your ears, et cetera, because that's where everything sort of comes together in any case, or most everything in terms of conscious awareness. Even pain is central, right? There's sort of an illusory quality to pain, as an example, that, if I stub my toe, the pain is in my toe. But that's not actually true. The damage, there are nociceptors that are picking up potential damage to my toe, right? But the actual sensation of pain, which in many cases, or in a variety of cases, can be blocked, that is a creature of your central nervous system, or that's a product of your central nervous system. Pain is in your brain, effectively, right? So that speaks to the sort of this sort of central locus. Even though when you feel pain, it seems as if you can localize it to a point in your body, and indeed you can, to the extent that that's where potential damage is occurring. That's where your nociceptors have kind of gone off. But that's about it.
So what have you gotten from studying the octopus? You say it's an alien intelligence, but what are the things that you learned that have surprised you about studying it?
I guess one of the things that surprised me from early on, and just because I had my own prejudices about invertebrates that I had encountered, mostly insects and some pretty sophisticated insects, including really large praying mantises and such. A particular prejudice I came to all of this with was the notion that, that they had very limited capacity to attend to the world, or to attend to me, right, as some sort of entity in the world, that I wasn't used to, or I wasn't at all prepared for the idea that here's this invertebrate and he's looking at me and he's actually tracking me with his eyes, and he's more or less seemingly patiently observing and not necessarily doing anything, just sort of watching me. And it's clear that he's watching me because I can see his pupils following me. Strange as those pupils are, I can see that his eyes are more or less tracking me. And that was pretty extraordinary, and that was a very early sort of a revelation, personal revelation for me. My very first encounter with an octopus in Italy, in a tank at the Steptoon Zoologica in Naples, the oldest European marine station, which is a remarkable place. So from that very first encounter, I had this figuratively and literally eye-opening experience that here's this animal that doesn't have a backbone, and it's attending to me, and it has, it's following me. And seemingly, with all of that, I was thinking, I asked myself when I observed this, well, what's going on between those two eyes that seem to be tracking me? Because those sophisticated eyes didn't appear in a vacuum. They didn't evolve in a vacuum. There's a lot of neural processing behind them. And so that led me on the path, I guess, to where I am today. And where I am today is I'm trying to, with my colleague Peter at Dartmouth, we're very interested in vision. We're interested in perception. We're particularly interested in the building blocks of what you might call awareness, one being memory. So visual perception, memory, these things are kind of driving my particular interest in the octopus today. What
are you getting from its visual perception? If we just look at vision only,
mm-hmm.
What is the, I don't know, what's the alienness of their perception versus ours? Are they just literally seeing in a different visible spectrum? Are they somehow able to interpret visual data very differently than us? What's the learnings from that?
Right. So one thing we do know is that, yes, they are from the world in a different sort of spectrum, right? Sort of shifted down to blue, the bluish range. right? And we've only identified one photoreceptor, so we know that they don't have a color vision that's akin to what we have, even though they seem to be able to match. They seem to be able to match different wavelengths. We can see it in their camouflage, that they're able to sort of blend into objects of different colors. So the thing that I'm stuck on is the idea of vision, the idea of the eye as a way into other things. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand elements like working memory, short-term memory of different kinds through the use of the visual pathway. So vision is both interesting in the sense that they have this remarkable vision for an invertebrate, this remarkable visual capacity for an invertebrate, but it's also very practical for us. And what we're getting at and what we're beginning to glean from via the visual sense is that these animals have sophisticated forms of memory. We're really, again, concentrating on the building blocks. We're not going after consciousness in and of itself right now, right? That would be kind of, for any researcher at this point who's working with a model organism that hasn't really been sussed out in such great detail yet, it would probably be the acme of foolishness to say, oh, we're going to go after the brass ring and we're going to figure out if these animals are conscious. No, what's the best way to go about it if you're a scientist? I think the best way is to say, well, what are the contingent elements of consciousness, right? What are the things that are important for the conscious faculty? And one thing that's important is, in our case, we're very visual, right? So vision figures very importantly into our sort of sense of awareness or how we build, sort of models of the world that we can refer to consciously in recall. And of course, animals have different. I mean, I'm not saying that vision is the be all and end all of consciousness. Of course, it isn't. And people often ask me, well, you're so fixated on vision. What about
Well,
mold?
vision's a good proxy. Like
What's that?
You said, the octopus can rip the face masks off divers. It knows to do that, right?
Squid can do that. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, squid. Okay.
Yeah.
So I know I keep going wrong animal here, but let's just say squid.
That's okay.
So at least with squid, they know themselves. They know that's the diver. They have a visual memory. They've seen the shape of the thing before. They've seen the mask very specifically, which is a very specific visual acuity. They know to pull it off, and that'll get the creature to leave. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of intelligence and, stuff wrapped up, and consciousness just wrapped up in that one action.
Yes. And so, one thing that you can do with these animals, and octopus in particular, is you can subject them to the same kinds of experimental paradigms that people have done in vertebrates for, almost 100 years, right? People have done tests involving mazes, right? Involving some sort of problem solving, involving something that looks like it requires a task that requires some kind of inhibition. In other words, instead of just grabbing something, right, reflexively, it's food, I'm going to eat it, whatever. They have to wait. There's some sort of there's a go, no-go paradigm that actually is very good for sort of looking at this sort of thing. But what we're trying to do essentially is to repeat quite a bit of the work that has already been done in vertebrate animals, in particular in rodents, and definitely in primates. And that's a long road to hoe. That's a lot of work ahead of us. But it's really important, and it's important to establish these sorts of things. It's sort of trying to apply what was called psychophysics starting in the late 19th century and into the 20th, applies a psychophysical approach to this amazing invertebrate in a way that nobody has done before. So,
well, are you doing this, or are there other scientists that you're looking at their experiments and applying?
Well, that's primarily our interest. I mean, I don't know whether there are any other scientists out there who are doing it. It seems like something that, most people have sort of either studiously or, without any particular deliberation have avoided. I don't see that approach being worked out in other places. But so that's something that I think that we're trying to do that's kind of new.
Tell me
people
some
have
amazing octopus cognitive achievements. What have you seen? That's really amazing and cool.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing about it is, and I don't want to poo-poo the work that anybody has already done. There's been, as I said, there's been a lot of work on the behavior of these animals. There's certainly a body of literature. A lot of that A lot of those studies, or quite a few of them, were sort of observations from the wild. Some of them were experimental in aquaria all over the world, in laboratories all over the world. But what I would say about these approaches is they haven't been particularly systematic, right? They didn't seem to have a sort of a grand organizing principle, right? So okay, well, let's study memory in the octopus, or let's study something, let's look for this. But they haven't sort of reached for sort of a greater goal and sort of, gotten their ducks in a row in any systematic fashion. And that's kind of the thing. That's sort of the approach that we're mostly in right now.
And again, what are you trying to find and why? What's your goal?
So the goal is, again, to find, to work out whether we can demonstrate what I think of as many of the building blocks for awareness, for consciousness in the octopus. One building block is memory, working memory in particular. Another building block is what's often called binding, the idea that the animal is capable of integrating different sensory channels or submodal properties of one sensory channel into a unified percept, right? That's something we can do on a dime. As humans, as primates, as mammals generally, we do that. We don't think anything of it, right? In your mind's eye, if you're looking at a computer right now, you have a gestalt of your Mac or your PC, right? Now, if you, in closer examination, you can sort of spotlight various features of that. I'm looking at my Mac and I see MacBook Pro. There's a label underneath my screen that says MacBook Pro. Well, that's a little detail, but in general, you have a percept of a computer, of a laptop, right? That involves...
Here's a quick question. So like an octopus, I would think they have like burrows in a coral reef, right? They have a certain place they go like to hide.
Yeah, some species will burrow into the sand to hide or to hide themselves from predator or prey. Some will, nest themselves within a reef. There are some beautiful videos of an octopus. Yeah.
Yeah, so the one that nests itself in a reef, does it always go to the same spot in the reef? And does it,
Often they do.
If it does, for instance, well, that's memory. Yeah. And the octopus knows it has to like contort itself in a certain way to fit in there, or that even in the first place it does fit in there. So all that I would think would demonstrate all this stuff.
Well, that's one. Yes. I mean, that's definitely sort of in some encouraging evidence. But when we're talking about memory and we're talking about awareness, let me sort of one ground rule I should sort of straighten out for me at least is that I have a very sort of liberal definition of what memory is. If you can pull together something into a unified percept, in other words, let's say, I see something that looks like a cookie. I've never seen it before. It has these brown chips in it, these chocolate chips. It's giving off a smell that's very pungent. It's very enticing, sugary smell. It has a particular feel, and I can taste something that's distinct about it. Those are all sort of different. Those are coming in on different sensory channels, and I'm pulling that all together. And I will remember that in future that will be a sort of a preserved percept that later, attains the label cookie, right? Let's say I'm a 10-month or 12-month-old infant, and this is my first encounter with cookie. Well, there's no good reason that all of those sensory aspects of that cookie should be causally related to me before I actually see a cookie or I experience a cookie. As far as my nervous system is concerned, all of those things coming in on different sensory channels simultaneously, more or less, are coincident, but they're not necessarily causally related. Now, they become causally related when I come to know this thing that's called a cookie, right? So that's a unified percept. And if I can hold that in memory, and memory doesn't have to be very long. I mean, if I can hold something in memory for a short period of time. Now, what I'm talking about now is almost it's an episodic-like memory. But you don't necessarily have to assume that episodic memory is the be-all and end-all for conscious awareness. You could sort of start with working, right? Working memory is very short-term, doesn't last very long, but it also involves, it is some sort of a memory. If you can show even something like working memory in an invertebrate, like a cephalopod, you're a long way toward, making a good argument for awareness being there. And it sounds really, in a way, I know to a lot of people it sounds sort of silly that, well, all of this stuff seems obvious to us. And of course, viscerally, in my gut, when I look at my dogs or when I watch my dogs interacting with me, I say, well, of course they're conscious. They're doing all these things. But again, there's a distinction between that kind of an observation, which is sort of everyday, whatever, and a scientific observation, which may be based on, repetition of a particular kind of experiment, something that's systematic and empirical, right? And I have to be very careful. People often talk about anthropomorphism, right? Sort of assuming sort of human-like properties in an animal that isn't human at all. This is
conscious doesn't need to mean human. Intelligence doesn't need to mean human.
Right. But what I'm saying is you have to be careful to make a distinction between a sort of a feeling, an observation that's in a way kind of anecdotal and something that's kind of systematic. That's what scientists do, right? So I can show systematically that a particular kind of an animal, whether it's an octopus or something else, has different kinds of memory. It has working memory or it has episodic memory, and I can do this experimentally, and people have done this experimentally for a whole variety of animals. And again, we have to be really careful when we're trying to suss out something like consciousness, because, well, for one thing, there are a lot of people who would say there's no agreed upon definition for what consciousness is, and they'd probably be right, even though to me, I have a definition that I've sort of accepted over the years. That it's pretty simple. It's a very plain vanilla notion of consciousness, but it works for me. The idea that consciousness, at the bare minimum, in my mind, must be the ability of an organism to pull together, as I said before, disparate aspects of sensation into a bound percept, and something that's integrated and that's of a piece, right? It's whole. It's a unitary thing. And then further recall that or hold that in memory for a certain length of time. It doesn't have to be very long at all. It can be a few seconds. But if you can bind something together and have that dynamic representation bound together, persist in your head for a time, that's all I need. That is a basic form of awareness. That is, to my mind, sensory awareness. Now, is that awareness is that self-awareness? No. That's something somewhat more primitive than self-awareness. That's awareness, maybe of a scene, but not of a self, not of a me or an I running around in that scene. Okay, and as a scientist, it's kind of I have to approach this in a sort of a systematic way, and I have to sort of say, okay, well, these are the elements that are critical to conscious processing. And I need to show each of these individually to make my case, because I can't simply say, here's an experiment that is, a slam dunk that shows that these animals are absolutely aware. But by proving that they have these other faculties, which are very, very important for conscious process, and without which you wouldn't have conscious, I can sort of be more conservative about it and make a more careful and deliberative case. I hope that helps.
Who said that is the base form of consciousness and not self versus non-self?
Well, a number of people have. Of course, maybe it's my own prejudice. There are other people who said something similar. My dad, for one, did when he was sort of working at his theory of consciousness, did make a distinction between primary consciousness, which is what I just described, this idea that you're pulling together the world into unitary sensory percepts, and then you're holding them in memory for a certain length of time. And he distinguished that from the appearance of an agent on the scene and the notion of an I, And, there are certain animals in the world that it seems pretty clear, at least in the wild, don't seem to have, at least as far as we understand it, don't seem to have this notion of agent, of an I. I as in I, the letter I, not E-Y-E, but I, right? They don't necessarily seem to have it, even though in the laboratory you can expose them to a particular kind of pedagogy. You can train them in a particular way, and they seem to develop a sense of self. One perfect example in my mind is Alex the parrot, famously raised by Irene Pepperberg, who still does her research at Harvard. And Irene took this very, very young African gray parrot, raised it from a year old, and had Alex for 30 years with the express purpose originally of figuring out whether she could train this animal to develop the rudiments of language, hence Alex, avian language experiment. Alex was short for avian language experiment. But what I think Irene, uncovered, and she may or may not agree with me here in the course of her work with Alex, is that while Alex may not have had some sort of sense of self originally, he certainly developed one. He could refer in some way, or that was clear that in some sense he was referring to himself relative to the world. And that's important. And again, going back to the immune response, a cell being able to differentiate between a foreign invader, a pathogen, and some cell that's part of the body of its host, that seems to be a very, very different thing. It's definitely a sort of a very primal distinction of self versus non-self, but it's pretty way down there in terms of sophistication. And you're not talking about, I don't think that immune cells, I don't think that T cells are sitting around contemplating themselves meandering around in a world. They're not imagining, themselves moving around in the world and what in that world is part of the body versus what is part of something else. So
that's their whole job, though. I don't think they're wondering; they're just acting, living in the moment.
But I think that
they seem to definitely know self from non-self.
Yeah, but I think that you just put your finger on you just put your finger on it by saying they're just acting, right? That's just distinctly different than me contemplating something that I haven't done yet, right? Something that I am going to do relative to the rest of the world. That's a different sort of thing. Then that involves a particular form of memory that I don't think you will find in T cells, that you won't find in the immune system as a whole. Clearly, the immune system has some form of what we might say is a memory, right?
Right.
Memory of what they've been exposed to, right? And their memory is essentially, it's a repertoire, right? So there's a great deal of variety in the immune system. There's huge variation in the immune system. There are many different kinds of antibodies. No two species, if you will, of antibody are exactly alike, and that's why the system works as well as it works. So in a sense, I mean, I think we have to be careful because we can get into a sort of a facile view of self versus non-self that doesn't make this distinction, right? That when I talk about me and myself, I am essentially that self is based on, it's based on my history of interactions with the world, as is, the way an immune system responds to the world. It has a memory, but that's the immune system as a whole. That's not an individual T cell. Right. And I would never say
the individual T cell still, where did it get that original playbook? That was inherited. So it must have been stored somewhere as memory.
No, the individual T cell, by virtue of its conformation, that it's carrying antibodies that have a particular conformation. That conformation is genetically imbued. I mean, essentially, that conformation is fixed. When you come into the world, you come into the world with a variety of antibodies, a huge variety of antibodies. You have a repertoire already. Now, that repertoire grows to an extent, but the fact that you already have that repertoire means your immune system is essentially, the way it works is it's matching the repertoire with the world, right? So the world is the world of pathogens, the world of antigens, things that are coming in that are foreign, right? And it's not that you're making antibodies that are entirely new to fit an antigen. The antibody already is there, and by virtue of the fact that the antigen has come, say, into one of your lymph nodes, means that there's a great chance that it's going to encounter an antibody that has just a good enough fit to kill the antigen. In other words, the repertoire already exists. It's not that the antibody.
What about vaccines? There's tremendous adaptation, and there's tremendous adaptation in people. Immunity.
Of course there is. But
everything.
that adaptation largely is based on the fact that you have this massive, almost hyperastronomical variation that already exists in your immune system. You're born with a vast repertoire of different kinds of antibodies. And even though you're born with that, yes, you make new antibodies, and new antibodies with new conformations are created, but they're not really created on the basis of an encounter with an antigen. It's almost like random mutation in the role of mutation in evolution, right? Mutation creates variation.
You're a neo-Darwinist, okay? So you say that.
Well, I'm Darwinian, right?
It's random.
Right, but the point about it is it's not all random. There's a random element to it. The random element is in the case of organisms, like in the case of complex animals, there's a random element in the sense of mutations occurring, and mutations provide the grist for the mill, right? So the more mutations you have that survive, that you have if you're a species or a population of animals, the more different kinds of animals you have within that species, the greater the likelihood that species will survive any potential change in the environment, because they'll have it in their repertoire already to survive. Some of them won't make it, but the ones that have just the right phenotype based on perhaps a mutation will survive, and then they replicate, that they make more, right? So the population of that particular variant increases. Same thing with the immune response. When an antibody encounters an antigen and there's a successful meshing of the two and the antigen dies, signal is sent to the cell. The T cell divides, thus therefore making more of that particular kind of antibody. And so you've just had an increase in the population of that kind of antibody. So the next time you encounter that antigen or something similar, you're going to be very well equipped. That is a form of adaptation. But it's a form of adaptation that's based on, by and large, a repertoire that existed before the encounter with the antigen, if you get my drift. Does that make sense?
I don't know. I don't believe it, but okay. Yeah. Doesn't seem
well,
like
but that's the central.
Random,
that's
but everything else
okay.
is, too bad.
Right, but that's the central dogma of response today, and that's what, by and large, my dad's Nobel Prize is predicated. That was showing, in effect, that now immune systems are very, very flexible, but a lot of the flexibility comes from the fact that the repertoire of different kinds of antibodies is really, really vast, and it is vast enough so that it's equipped for a lot of things that you can throw at it. Is it equipped for everything? No. Cancers, certain kinds of cancers elude the immune system, although we can do things that will perhaps change. There are certain kinds of immunotherapy that are being employed right now to combat certain varieties of cancer. But the bottom line is, this is a view of the immune response. This is a form of immunology. The modern view of immunology is all based on this idea. It's selectionism. It's not instruction. It's not the world instructing from outside. It's the fact that you already have the repertoire. Yeah, you're generating more and more variety over the course of your lifetime, but by and large, you already have a vast repertoire, and the antigens that are coming in are encountering, there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be just good enough of a fit between an antibody that already exists and a new antigen coming in that antigen can be defeated. And that is, I think, that's the premise of the immune responses, as I think most folks understand it today. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think.
So well, I've seen plenty of papers showing that bacteria get antibiotic resistance by shuttling DNA and code to each other, essentially, so they can evade, an antibiotic. It's not just a passive thing where one magically lives and the rest die, and that one just.
So you're talking about horizontal transfer.
Yeah, there's an active response, for instance, by bacteria to antibiotics.
Sure, but that's somewhat different than the immune response. But yes, and we don't know much about horizontal transfer and horizontal gene transfer or DNA transfer in very complex organisms, but you're right. Yes, that's a way that bacteria do, that's a mode of survival for bacteria. But those are bacteria, and that's not really, even though that's a survival mechanism, that's not an immune response per se. That's not immunity as we understand. That's something a little bit different, right?
Yeah, no, I know. Right.
Right. But so I'm not saying that that's not possible. I think that, we may very well find a mechanism that's very similar to that, and it wouldn't surprise me at all. But by and large, what we understand about what T cells do and what most of your immune response is made up of sort of suggests that you have a repertoire. Now, the repertoire is being built on over the course of a lifetime, but by and large, you have a vast repertoire to begin with, and that's what kind of gives you a leg up. Anyway, sorry, we've gone off on a tangent.
So, no problem. What's the so what would be an ideal for you to figure out about octopi and octopuses? What's your goal what do you hope to figure out, and where do you go from there?
Well, I think that one of the important things to sort of understand is whether octopuses have, whether the forms of memory that octopuses possess allow them to, whether an octopus essentially can hold in its brain or in its mind, if you like, some sort of a unified percept, something that is, sort of multimodal in property, and it can recall it, and you can show evidence that it recalls that percept. That sounds pretty straightforward, but in order to demonstrating it is another matter entirely. But when you've gotten to that point, I think you can start to make a very, very good case that animals are aware. So that's that's what we're headed for. That's what we want to do. We want to show, I think, in the end, that octopuses, can sort of integrate the world, bind together some sort of a unitary percept, and hold it in time, and even recall it to some good end, and devising experiments to sort of test that kind of thing. It's not that straightforward of a venture. It's possible, but even in the case of very, very complex vertebrates, certain mammals, even primates, that's been tough to do. I mean, people are doing those sorts of things. One other goal we have is to actually look at the electrophysiology, or look at the neurophysiology that's going on in an octopus's brain when an octopus is doing something, when it's solving a problem, when it's observing a particular object it's associated with food, et cetera, et cetera. We want to see what the physiology looks like. What do the waveforms look like? Because when we do these kinds of things, when we do electrophysiology in the case of vertebrates, mammals in particular, and some birds, we can establish particular kinds of waveforms across these animals that have sort of a similarity based on what it is they're doing in the world, right? So there's kind of a lingua franca of neural activity that can be associated with different kinds of behaviors, with different kinds of things that vertebrates are doing. What would be wonderful is if we could do the same sort of thing in octopus and say, hey, wait a second, even though they're very, very different looking, they're embodied in a totally different way than a vertebrate, right? But they nevertheless have complex brains. The physiology underlying that brain and what that brain does, my working hypothesis is there probably aren't 9 ways to skin a cat in that case. There's probably, the waveforms are probably going to look very similar. I mean, to some extent, neurons are neurons, basically, even though, octopuses have, essentially a lot of monopolar neurons. They have some other kinds of neurons. We have bipolar, we have multipolar neurons. So we have different kinds of neurons, but neurons are doing particular kinds of things that are sort of universal, right? There are inhibitory neurons, there are excitatory neurons, there are neurons that cause other neurons to fire, there are neurons that cause other neurons not to fire. And that's kind of a universal. So there's sort of a universal aspect to all of this, which suggests, at least in my mind, that if we're looking for the signatures of certain kinds of brain functions, like attention, for example, right? Attention is something that's been very well studied in a lot of different vertebrates, but in the octopus, really not so much. Well, what if we sort of connected the octopus to, what if we did the same, we did some EEG type experiments on the octopus while the octopus was actually behaving? Would we see waveforms that resemble the vertebrate case, when the octopus is attending to something versus when the attention gets lost, when it is trying to keep track of a particular object as it moves through the world, whether it's capable of falling for a visual illusion. That's something also an interesting sort of a thing that's being tried on different non-human animals. There are some famous illusions that have been, successfully, have been shown to various vertebrates, and the vertebrates have the response that suggests that, in fact, they fall for the illusion the same way we fall for the illusion. Well, what is the neurophysiology like? Well, for an octopus, are the waveforms the same? Is there a lingua franca that applies across all animals with complex nervous systems, or will they look very different? And my suspicion, or at least my my default hypothesis, right, is that what we're going to find is there's kind of a universal physiology there, right? That we'll see for attention, we're going to see waveforms that may look very similar to the vertebrate case. So that's another thing that's on our agenda, I think. So you might call that the signature.
Very good. We're right at the end of the time, but what's the best way for people to find out more and contact you and see your papers and all that stuff?
Oh, well, that's a good question. At the moment, I don't have an active website, so that's a little tough. But I guess just keep track of the what's going on at the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Dartmouth. We're still kind of very early on. We only finished building the lab last year, and things are going sort of slowly. But I suspect in time, we'll have the results up. But they should definitely follow, the work of Peter C. TSE from Dartmouth. They should follow my work. We'll hopefully be co-authors on a whole bunch of papers. And other than that, that's about it for the moment. But I would say just follow our work. Okay. And in short order,
David. Good.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
I know there's a lot of work ahead of you. There's years and years of work for everyone. But thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Sure thing.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.